When relationships end, people usually search for one dramatic moment: the argument, the betrayal, the mistake that broke everything. But most breakups don't collapse in a single explosion. They erode, slowly, quietly, through patterns that were present from the very beginning. In the case of Common and Jennifer Hudson, the warning signs did not suddenly appear. They were always there, subtle, often ignored, and disguised as wisdom, maturity, or emotional depth. Long before Jennifer Hudson entered his life, Common openly acknowledged something important about himself. He admitted that relationships require time, energy, and consistency, and that his lifestyle often made those things difficult. Touring schedules, work obligations, constant movement. He described how distance and lack of emotional investment had weakened past relationships, not because the love disappeared, but because it was no longer being nurtured. That confession mattered because it revealed a core truth. Common understood intimacy in theory, but struggled with it in practice. People close to him have often described him as someone who enjoys connection but resists permanence. Someone who thrives on the excitement of beginnings but becomes restless when relationships settle into routine. One commentator famously compared him to a beam moving from one flower to the next, always chasing something fresh, never staying long enough to build roots. This wasn't gossip, it was a pattern. And Jennifer Hudson walked into that pattern. Fully aware of his history, from the outside, their relationship looked balanced. Jennifer was strong, self-aware, and grounded by life experience. Common presented himself as reflective, evolved, and emotionally intelligent. He spoke about compromise, values, and understanding that no partner is perfect. He emphasized core alignment over surface flaws, framing love as a conscious choice rather than fantasy. On paper, this sounded like growth, but wisdom spoken aloud does not always translate into behavior lived daily. For months, fans believed they were watching a fairy tale unfold. Two icons finding love later in life. Two people shaped by pain, success, and survival, choosing each other with intention. Interviews reinforced that image. Red carpet appearances reinforced it. Public admiration reinforced it, and Common leaned into that narrative. He described Jennifer Hudson as a blessing, a gift, someone who brought peace into his life. He spoke about partnership, balance, and the idea of building something real. 4. A man long criticized for being emotionally unavailable. These words felt significant. Almost redemptive. Fans celebrated him for finally getting it right. But behind the polished interviews and affectionate moments, something didn't fully align. Because while Jennifer appeared invested in building something lasting, Common's history suggested that stability was not his natural destination. It was something he visited briefly before moving on, and history rarely stays buried for long. Jennifer Hudson, meanwhile, carried her own emotional scars. She had survived intense personal tragedy, public heartbreak, and a relationship that left deep wounds. She had learned through pain that love without safety can be destructive. That commitment without trust can become a prison. So while she embraced love, she also guarded herself. That difference in emotional pacing would later become critical of the beginning. Those differences were easy to ignore. Attraction masked incompatibility, disguised imbalance. Public praise drowned out private hesitation. But relationships don't survive on admiration. Alone, they survive on alignment. And slowly the cracks began to form, not through chaos, but through quiet misalignment. Different expectations, different timelines, different emotional needs. One partner leaning toward permanence, the other still addicted to possibility. By the time the fairy tale started to unravel publicly, the foundation had already been weakening privately, and the question was no longer whether they cared for each other. It was whether they were ever building the same future. When news first broke that Jennifer Hudson and Common were officially more than friends, the reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. It felt like the kind of love story people want to believe into accomplished icons, seasoned by life. Finding each other at a stage where games were supposedly over and intentions were clear. Jennifer Hudson was widely seen as America's sweetheart, a woman who had transformed unimaginable tragedy into strength, carried herself with grace, discipline, and emotional depth. Common, on the other hand, had cultivated an image of the thoughtful artist, the conscious rapper turned respected actor. Known for intelligence, charm, and introspection, together they looked like balance. Common reinforced this image early. In interviews, he didn't speak about Jennifer casually. He praised her openly, describing her as a blessing, a source of peace, and a stabilizing force in his life. He framed their connection as more than romance. He hinted at partnership, longevity, and something that extended far beyond surface attraction. For a man long accused of emotional restlessness, this was a major shift in tone, fans noticed. Social media flooded with praise. Comments celebrated Jennifer for finally getting the love she deserved, and applauded Common for seemingly growing into a man ready for commitment. Their public appearances only strengthened the illusion. Red carpet smiles, comfortable body, language, genuine laughter. Everything about them appeared natural and unforced. They didn't look like a publicity stunt. They looked real. But fairy tales are often convincing precisely because they hide their flaws so well behind the carefully curated public image. Common's past was quietly looming. His history with relationships was never a secret. It was extensive, public, and remarkably consistent. Time and time again, he entered high-profile romances with powerful women only for each relationship to end without lasting commitment. And those patterns don't disappear just because the partner changes. While Jennifer Hudson may have been enjoying the public warmth surrounding the relationship, insiders suggest that the private reality was more complicated. Maintaining a relationship at their level of fame required sacrifice, emotional availability, and prioritization. And this is where old habits reportedly began to surface. Common's career kept him moving. Projects, appearances, obligations, time together became harder to protect. Emotional investment became uneven. The relationship was no longer being fed consistently, and as he himself had admitted in the past, neglect has a way of slowly starving even genuine affection. The love didn't necessarily disappear, but the effort reportedly did. Jennifer, by contrast, was approaching the relationship from a place of intention. Having endured a painful past, she was not interested in surface-level romance. She valued emotional safety, consistency, and trust. Love to her wasn't just about excitement. It was about stability. That difference mattered. Because while Common often spoke about compromise and understanding imperfections, applying those principles consistently proved far more difficult than articulating them. Relationships demand not just shared values, but synchronized timelines. And it became increasingly clear that their emotional clocks were ticking at different speeds. Publicly, everything still looked fine. But fans began to notice small changes. Jennifer attending events alone, fewer shared appearances. Subtle shifts in energy when they did appear together. Nothing dramatic, but enough to spark curiosity. And once curiosity begins, speculation follows. Industry whispers began suggesting tension. Not explosive fights, but quiet distance. Disagreements left unresolved. Conversations avoided rather than confronted. The kind of issues that don't make headlines but slowly weaken bonds. People close to the situation hinted that ego may have started playing a role. To strong personalities, to successful careers, to individuals used to control. And independence? Navigating that dynamic requires humility. Humility does not always come easily when fame, admiration, and public praise are constant. The more successful Jennifer became, the more visible the imbalance may have felt. Not financially necessarily, but in public perception. Jennifer Hudson's star power continued to rise, while Common's image remained tied to a legacy rather than momentum. That shift, subtle as it was, may have created unspoken tension, and then came the rumors that truly shook the fairy tale talk of a proposal. According to multiple accounts, Common had begun expressing interest in taking the next step: marriage, permanence, a future defined not by possibility, but by commitment. Given his public statements, this did not seem far-fetched. He had already told the world that if he were ever to marry, Jennifer Hudson would be the woman. But when the idea moved closer to reality, Jennifer hesitated, not because she didn't care, but because she remembered what rushing had cost her before. That hesitation, small as it may seem, reportedly changed everything. For Common, who thrives on affirmation and momentum, the pause may have felt like rejection. For Jennifer, it was self-protection. Two interpretations of the same moment colliding in silence. From that point forward, insiders suggest the dynamic shifted. What had once been admiration slowly turned into frustration. What had felt like partnership began to feel like resistance. The fairy tale was no longer effortless. It required work, and for someone who historically struggled once relationships left the honeymoon phase, that work may have felt heavier than expected. The public still saw smiles, but behind those smiles, the illusion was starting to crack. To understand why the relationship between Common and Jennifer Hudson began to unravel, it is necessary to look beyond rumors and headlines and examine something far more revealing. Common's own words. Long before Jennifer entered his life, Common had already explained himself. In interviews, podcasts, and reflective conversations, he openly acknowledged a recurring issue in his romantic life. He described a pattern of falling deeply, intensely, and quickly, only to lose interest once the relationship transitioned from excitement to routine. He did not frame this as cruelty or manipulation. He framed it as a flaw, a struggle, something he was actively trying to understand. He called it love addiction, not addiction to people, but addiction to the feeling of being in love. The early stage of a relationship gave him a rush. The anticipation, the discovery, the emotional electricity. He thrived in the honeymoon phase, where everything felt new and possibility was limitless. In those moments, he showed up fully romantic, attentive, emotionally present. But once that phase faded, something shifted. As comfort replaced novelty, Common often became restless. The emotional high he chased began to dull, and without realizing it, he would start disengaging. Not necessarily through betrayal, but through absence. Less effort, less focus, less emotional availability. This is where many of his relationships quietly died, because long-term love is not built on adrenaline. It is built on repetition, patience, and consistency. And that was where Common struggled most. Jennifer Hudson entered the relationship believing that Common had grown past this phase. He spoke about therapy, healing, self-awareness. He acknowledged his past openly and framed it as something he had worked through. For Jennifer, someone who valued growth and emotional accountability, this mattered. She believed the self-reflection was real, and in the beginning, it may have been. But growth is not proven by insight alone. It is proven by behavior under pressure. As the relationship matured, the emotional demands changed. Jennifer was not interested in surface-level affection or symbolic gestures. She wanted presence, stability, reliability, not just when it was exciting, but when it was ordinary. And that's when Common's internal conflict reportedly intensified, because the very things Jennifer needed, routine, predictability, emotional grounding, were the same things that historically caused him to feel confined. What she saw as safety, he may have experienced as stagnation. What she viewed as commitment, he may have subconsciously interpreted as limitation. This disconnect was subtle but powerful. Jennifer had already lived through chaos. She was not chasing thrills, she was protecting peace. She had learned that intense love without emotional safety can be damaging. So she approached the relationship deliberately, cautiously, and with boundaries. Common, however, had spent years chasing intensity. And when the intensity softened, discomfort returned. This does not make him a villain, but it does make him incompatible with someone who needed steadiness above all else. Insiders suggest that as Jennifer leaned into emotional depth, Common began pulling back. Not abruptly, not publicly, but gradually. Conversations became shorter. Priorities shifted. The relationship stopped being fed with the same energy it once received. Jennifer noticed, and when one partner notices emotional withdrawal, they respond. In one of two ways: they chase harder or they protect themselves. Jennifer chose protection. She did not beg. She did not dramatize. She slowed down. She observed. She questioned whether the relationship was truly aligned with the future she wanted. And when the topic of permanence marriage came closer to reality, she hesitated. That hesitation was not about lack of love, it was about fear of repeating history. Jennifer had already committed once for years, only to watch it collapse painfully. She had promised herself never to rush into lifelong decisions without certainty. And when certainty wasn't there, she refused to force it for Common. That pause may have felt like rejection, and rejection is especially difficult for someone whose confidence is tied to being desired, chosen, and admired, particularly in the early stages of love. Once the chase ended, and once affirmation was no longer constant, Common's old patterns allegedly resurfaced. Emotional distance, detachment, disengagement, not because he didn't care, because he did not know how to stay once the excitement was gone. This is the paradox of love addiction. The addict does not lack love. They lack endurance. They confuse intensity with intimacy and novelty with connection. And when a relationship demands emotional labor rather than emotional rush, they often retreat. Jennifer Hudson did not need to be chased. She needed to be met, and that difference defined the turning point. As Common struggled with his own emotional restlessness, Jennifer faced a decision: continue investing in a relationship that felt increasingly uneven, or step back before it became another chapter of regret. What followed next? The proposal rumors, the alleged resentment. The shifting narrative can only be understood through this lens, because when someone addicted to beginnings is confronted with permanence, they often react not with clarity, but with resistance. And that resistance would soon reshape everything. The public thought they knew about this relationship for a long time. The relationship between Common and Jennifer Hudson appeared to be moving in a steady, intentional direction. Public affection remained. Interviews were still warm. The narrative, at least on the surface, suggested that this was not just another celebrity romance, but a serious partnership, slowly progressing toward permanence. Then the rumors began. Quiet at first, almost harmless. Whispers that Common was thinking about proposing, that he had discussed marriage with people close to him, that he had even said more than once that if he ever walked down the aisle, Jennifer Hudson would be the woman standing across from him. This wasn't tabloid exaggeration. These were statements Common himself had made publicly. For fans, that felt like confirmation. Proof that he had finally reached a point in life where commitment was not just an idea, but a goal. For Jennifer, however, the situation was far more complicated. Behind the scenes, sources claimed Jennifer Hudson was not ready to say yes, not because she didn't love Common, but because she understood the weight of what marriage had already cost her once before. Her previous long-term relationship with David Otunga had left deep emotional scars. Years of tension, public accusations, legal battles, and emotional instability had reshaped how she viewed commitment. Marriage to Jennifer was no longer a fairy tale. It was a risk. She had spent years rebuilding her sense of safety, independence, and emotional balance. The idea of rushing into another lifelong commitment, especially one that carried public scrutiny, felt overwhelming. According to insiders, she was clear about this from the beginning. She was not opposed to love. She was cautious about permanence. That caution reportedly collided directly with Common's expectations. For someone who thrives on momentum, affirmation, and emotional certainty, Jennifer's hesitation may have felt like a rejection, regardless of how thoughtfully it was expressed. Sources suggest that Common interpreted her reluctance not as trauma-informed self-protection, but as doubt about him, and that distinction mattered. People close to the situation claim this was the moment the emotional balance shifted. Where Common had once appeared patient and supportive, frustration allegedly began to creep in. Where admiration once flowed freely, disappointment took its place. The relationship stopped feeling like a shared journey and started feeling, to him, like resistance. This is where ego entered the room. Common had publicly declared his intentions. He had framed Jennifer as the one, to then face hesitation. Behind closed doors reportedly bruised his pride. Friends allegedly say he felt embarrassed, blindsided, and emotionally exposed. Instead of addressing those feelings openly, the dynamic allegedly changed. Insiders describe a subtle withdrawal, less emotional effort, less reassurance, less warmth. The man who once spoke passionately about partnership allegedly became distant, irritated, and harder to please. Jennifer noticed, and rather than chase him, she pulled back further. This created a feedback loop neither seemed prepared to break. The more Jennifer protected herself, the more Common allegedly felt rejected. The more Common withdrew, the more Jennifer questioned whether this relationship truly offered the safety she needed. From the outside, everything still appeared intact. But privately, trust was eroding. What made the situation more complicated was Common's own history. He had admitted on record that once relationships moved beyond excitement and into real emotional work, he struggled to stay engaged. Now faced with a partner who needed reassurance rather than grand gestures, his old patterns were allegedly resurfacing. According to multiple accounts, this was when Common allegedly began venting privately, expressing dissatisfaction, rewriting the narrative. Some even claim he started telling people that the relationship felt suffocating, that he could no longer stand the dynamic. For Jennifer, this was deeply unsettling. She had been honest about her boundaries. She had never promised marriage on a specific timeline. And yet, the relationship now felt as though her caution was being framed as failure. That framing hurt. Friends of Jennifer reportedly say she began to see familiar warning signs, the same emotional volatility, the same shifting blame, the same discomfort with boundaries that had defined her past relationship. Ashay had promised herself she would never ignore those signals again, so she stood her ground, and that decision, according to insiders, marked the true turning point. Because once the fantasy of a perfect future collapsed, Common allegedly stopped seeing the relationship as aspirational. Without the promise of permanence on his timeline, the connection lost its shine. What had once felt meaningful began to feel inconvenient. From that moment forward, the relationship reportedly moved from partnership to tension. And when tension replaces trust, even love struggles to survive. What followed next? Rumors of wandering, attention, alleged distractions, and growing emotional distance did not come out of nowhere. They were symptoms of a relationship already fractured at its core. The proposal may never have officially happened, but the rejection, real or perceived, changed everything.